Ladies and gentlemen, welcome into 5 college football teams that will undoubtedly be worse next year in 2024 here as we come up on the end of 2023. These are just 5 teams that I am guaranteeing will have a worse record next year. Let's get right into it, starting with Washington. Now, this one might be considered cheating considering Washington is 13-0. They are going to be losing their quarterback, Michael Penix Jr. They're losing their top 2 wide receivers. They're losing some of their elite defensive players, and also they are joining the Big Ten. And I think we're going to take a look at Washington's 2024 schedule, a relatively easy actually a very easy non-conference. You've got Washington State and then, Eastern Michigan and Weber State. But other than that, you still have games against Michigan, at Iowa's not easy, USC, at Penn State, possibly a whiteout game there, and then at Oregon to end the season. Washington right now is in the market for a transfer portal QB, possibly Will Rogers, although I don't think that's really going to cut it in terms of keeping Washington undefeated in 2024. I'm sure their fans are not expecting it because they are going to lose a ton of talent, with the most important being the Heisman finalist Michael Penix Jr. They should see a decline, and I would almost say maybe a 9-3, 8-4. I know they've got a really good coach that I do respect, but the schedule's going to get tougher, and if Will Rogers really is their transfer portal QB, I personally don't love that pick, but what are you going to do? Either way, I expect Washington to be significantly worse in 2024. The next team, it is Michigan. So Michigan is another team that finished 13-0 this season. They are the number 1 overall seed. But with Michigan, it's a combination of things. Really 3 different factors. Number 1, they're dealing with the Jim Harbaugh issue. What's going on with him possibly being suspended? Number 2, you're dealing with a bunch of super seniors that were there from the pandemic leaving the team. Although I will say normally Michigan always has a senior-laden team, but you're also talking about possibly replacing your quarterback, J.J. McCarthy. Can they get Dante Moore? How does the whole possible sanctions hanging over their head affect them in terms of being effective in the transfer portal? Could that scare kids away if Michigan possibly faces a bowl ban? And then you also do have a tougher schedule. Now, I will say in looking at this schedule, I don't think it's the crazy gauntlet that it was at the beginning of the year. I mean, Texas is going to be a very tough game. Jim Harbaugh very likely not coaching that, considering the NCAA suspended him originally for 4 games. Michigan self-imposed a 3-game suspension. So the NCAA said, all right, we'll table it and talk about it next year. Seems like Michigan was trying to get the NCAA to really lighten that suspension to possibly get Harbaugh back for the Texas game. However, now with the new scandal that's out about cheating, very likely Harbaugh will be suspended into the season. A lot of people don't even think Harbaugh will be at Michigan next year. You do have USC at home. I think that's very manageable for Michigan. USC's defense we would expect to be better. It's kind of hard not to, but they are going to be without Caleb Williams. They'll be starting probably a first-year quarterback unless they somehow get Dylan Gabriel. At Washington is a manageable game, I think, for Michigan, but it's tough. And then you also do have Oregon at home. That's another tough game. And then at Ohio State, obviously the rivalry game. But with Michigan, I see possibly 2 losses here. It's very hard to predict because I don't know what they're going to do in the portal. I don't know their starting quarterback next year. It's virtually guaranteed that it's going to be a transfer, though, based on who, currently is on their roster. Whether that's Dante Moore, whether that's someone else, I floated around the idea possibly of Will Howard for them, but either way, they should be worse considering all of the circumstances surrounding them, and also going undefeated back-to-back years, it is an extremely hard thing. The number 3 team that's guaranteed to be worse in 2024, it is Oregon State, and this is another one you're dealing with other circumstances. How about Oregon State? This is just so crippling and so demoralizing. You lose your head coach after having a breakout season, right? He's this new, young, up-and-coming coach. You lose him. You lose your number 1 quarterback after he transferred in, former 5-star who started to be developed by Oregon State. He's gone. And you lose your backup QB on top of that, who now is the number 1 overall rated transfer portal QB. And you've also lost your conference. And I went to look up Oregon State's schedule. Right now, they've got Idaho State. That's their first game at Boise State. That's a tough game. Boise State's going to be very good next year. And then versus Purdue, a random non-conference game. Now, Oregon State, their schedule should get a lot easier next year, but their roster talent is also significantly worse because they're in a de facto, group of five conference. Technically, they're really not in the Mountain West, but they're going to be facing a bunch of Mountain West teams. You're not going to be able to attract a lot of talent, obviously losing your head coach and both of your quarterbacks that did have significant potential. It is demoralizing. Oregon State is going to a really good bowl, the Sun Bowl. They're taking on Notre Dame, but they are going to be without all of those players, so they're sitting right now about 9-point underdogs. This one is just too easy. I had to choose it. Oregon State, even though you could argue with the schedule getting a lot easier, you're facing a bunch of Mountain West teams. I'm looking at that non-conference schedule, and I really could see two losses. I think they're going to lose to Boise State, and they might also lose to Purdue. Now, they're probably going to be favorites over Purdue, but either way, Oregon State, even with the easier schedule, because of all the losses, their head coach and both of their quarterbacks, and also we would expect other positions as well to head off to the portal just because you're not a Power 5 team anymore. Players are going to want to showcase their skills. Oregon State should be worse in 2024. The next team that should be worse in 2024, it is Louisville. And my basis for Louisville is more so, I think they kind of had a fluky year this year, honestly, especially when you look at, the loss to Kentucky, the loss to FSU, only scoring 6 points, very little offensive output. I have heard they are kind of active in the transfer portal, and if you take a look at their schedule, you could make an argument they should be decent next year. You do have a tough game at Notre Dame. I would be very surprised if they beat Notre Dame again, especially on the road. You also have a game at Clemson. I feel like that's 2 guaranteed losses, but a team like SMU, I think, could give them a lot of trouble. A team like Virginia, who's had a great second half of the year, could give them some trouble. I could very easily see 5 losses also on the road at Kentucky, the rivalry game there. Possibly 5 losses from Louisville. Obviously, this year they had a really good season. Unfortunately for them, with FSU missing out on the playoff, that kind of cost them a spot in a New Year's Six Bowl. But just in terms of Louisville, this is more so just, I think it's a fluke. They don't recruit well enough, even though the ACC is not a good conference. And you look at the teams that they're adding, I guess SMU is good, but Stanford certainly is not very good, and that should be kind of a layup win for a lot of teams in the ACC. Either way, Louisville should be worse in 2024. Their roster talent does not excite me. I'm guessing they will try and leverage their impressive 2023 season in the transfer portal. Jeff Brom, to me, he's kind of a streaky coach. He had a few decent seasons at Purdue, but he also had some pretty bad ones, so Louisville I would expect to take a step back in 2024. Certainly, I don't expect them to make the ACC championship. And before I get to the 5th and final team on this list, I do want to go over a few teams that I considered, number 1 being Iowa. So you would think Iowa, the terrible offense, the amazing defense, finally getting out of the Big Ten West, they would be guaranteed to be worse next year. Well, I don't know how Iowa does it, but they do have a very manageable schedule, even getting out of the Big Ten West next year. However, they are at Ohio State. They are going to be finally getting a new offensive coordinator, so I'm sure at least their offense, it's impossible for Iowa's offense not to improve, folks, let's be honest. And they should still have a really good defense, so I would still expect Iowa to take a step back, but still a very manageable schedule. They could still be an 8 or a 9 win team. And then the other team I'm not including is UCLA. So UCLA loses Dante Moore. Certainly you could argue that's a big loss, but in terms of him playing as a freshman, he really wasn't that good. UCLA had kind of a weird thing where it looked like they were going to fire Chip Kelly, then they end up keeping him. They were only 7-5 last year, so do I really think they're going to be worse than that? Maybe they go 6-6, 5-7, but they still do have some talent on that roster, and it wasn't like Dante Moore was the only quarterback starting games where they now need to replace him. Also, they do have a decent enough NIL fund to at least try and get a big-time transfer portal QB if Chip Kelly wants that. But let's move on to the 5th and final team I am guaranteeing will be worse next year, and it is Oklahoma State. Now, Oklahoma State started off this year losing to South Alabama. They went on a major run after 2 early losses. Then they lost to UCF 45-3. They get crushed by Texas in the Big 12 championship. And you would think maybe now the Big 12, with Texas and Oklahoma gone, it'll alleviate some of the problems for Oklahoma State. But I think next year the Big 12 conference will be a complete mosh pit. And you're looking at an Oklahoma State team, they're not going to be able to replicate the luck that they had this year, even with Ollie Gordon, their quarterback, who originally was a backup at Michigan. Very average, very pedestrian. I'm sure they're going to go portal shopping for a new one, but I do see Oklahoma State very likely going from 9-4 to about a 7-5 team next year in a much worse bowl game. Even though the conference is getting easier, I don't think Oklahoma State's going to be nearly as good and as nationally relevant. But either way, guys, that is going to do it for this video. Make sure you're following me on X. Link to that's always in the description.